right. Today we're going to dive into a really fascinating story that connects ancient language, some of the biggest names in scientific history, and a truly massive discovery in modern cosmology. Let's get right into it. For the vast majority of human history, we're talking over 2 millennia. If you asked any brilliant thinker out there, any philosopher, any astronomer about the universe, they would have told you the exact same thing with total confidence. And look, this wasn't just some popular idea. It was basically scientific law. From the ancient Greeks like Aristotle all the way up to giants of science like Isaac Newton, the consensus was absolutely rock solid. The universe was this grand, unchanging, celestial machine. So let's take a second just to get a really clear picture of this idea, because it dominated science for thousands of years. The model was actually pretty simple and, kind of beautiful. You had the Earth at the center, and it was surrounded by these perfect crystal-like spheres that held the planets and all the stars. It was a comfortable, it was a predictable, and most importantly, it was a completely static reality. It didn't get bigger, it didn't get smaller, it just was. Okay, so while the entire scientific world was completely united in that view, a totally different idea was being written down in a 7th-century text. An idea that was, well, according to the science of the time, just completely and utterly wrong. This is a verse from the Quran. It's describing the construction of the heavens, and it ends with this very, very specific Arabic word, Mûsiûn. And believe it or not, the grammar of that one single word is the key to this entire story. So here's the crucial part. It's all in the grammar. Mûsiûn is not a simple past tense verb. If it were, it would mean we expanded it, a single event that happened and is now over. But it's not. It's what's called an active participle. And what that means is that it implies a continuous, ongoing action. So the meaning isn't that the universe was expanded, but that its creator is still expanding it right now as we speak. And this slide just lays out the difference perfectly. On the left, you've got a single, completed event in the past. But on the right, which is the grammar actually used in the text, you have an ongoing process that is still happening. It's a really fundamental distinction. So you can probably see where this is going, right? This one little linguistic detail created a massive, massive problem for anyone trying to interpret this text for over 1,000 years. This timeline really puts the conflict into perspective. You've got Aristotle's static model as the undisputed scientific fact for centuries. Then, way later, this text comes along with a word that literally means continuously expanding. So, how could ancient scholars possibly square that circle? Well, they couldn't. The literal meaning went against everything they knew about science. So, they did the only logical thing they could. They interpreted it as a metaphor. They argued it must mean God's vastness and power, or maybe his generosity, not physical size. And that's pretty much how things stood for centuries. The literal meaning was just set aside, until one man, with one giant telescope, changed our understanding of literally everything. So back in 1929, an astronomer named Edwin Hubble noticed something weird. The light coming from distant galaxies was stretched out. It was shifting toward the red end of the spectrum. The best way to think about it is like the sound of an ambulance siren. You know how the pitch drops as it rushes away from you? This redshift meant the same thing. The galaxies weren't just sitting there. They were flying away from us. The entire fabric of space itself was expanding. So here's the incredible payoff. Hubble's discovery didn't just shatter a 2,000-year-old scientific belief. It also, for the very first time in history, made the literal grammatical meaning of that ancient word, Mûsiûn, scientifically plausible. The idea of a continuously expanding heaven was no longer absurd. And in fact, modern cosmology has since shown that not only is the universe expanding, but that expansion is actually accelerating. And this brings us right into the middle of the modern debate. How do we make sense of this? Was it just an incredibly lucky guess? Or could it be something more? Let's break down the two main perspectives. So what are we supposed to make of this? A 7th-century text using a very specific grammatical form that implies continuous expansion, a concept that would be scientifically unthinkable for another 1,300 years. Okay, so let's start with a skeptical argument, which is a fair and really important one. It basically says that we're looking back with our modern scientific knowledge and forcing that meaning onto ancient, poetic language. Just like we might say someone has a big heart, this view argues Mûsiûn was just a poetic way to describe God's immense power or richness, not a literal statement about astrophysics. The counterargument, though, points right back to the context of the verse itself. The sentence isn't about power or generosity, it's about the physical act of building the heavens. And in that context, if an architect tells you they are expanding their construction, the most direct logical meaning has to do with physical size, right? Not their character. And that brings us right back to this number, 1,300 years. That's how long the most literal, straightforward, grammatical meaning of this word stood in direct opposition to all of established science. So what's the big takeaway here? Think about it this way. For millennia, the absolute greatest minds in history all bet on a static, unchanging universe. This ancient text made a different bet, a very specific bet on continuous expansion. It just took us 1,300 years to finally build a telescope big enough to see who was right. Now, whether you see that as a wild coincidence, beautiful poetry, or a clue woven into ancient language, well, that's a fascinating question about how we find knowledge and where truth can sometimes hide.